Okay, we are going to talk about the DNA on the knife sheath. And then also I want to get into the two unknown male profiles, the one that was found on the banister and the one on the glove. But first, I'm still seeing a lot of people misinterpreting the knife sheath findings, okay? There was not a male profile mixed with Kaylee and Maddie's blood on the knife sheath. So that area that had the blood that they swapped, which was 1.4 on the documents, this is all from the ISP lab documents, it was a two-person mixture. There was no male DNA in that mixture at all. Let me show you the lab report. So for reference, this is 1.4, item 1.4, and that is the back of the knife sheath up in that area that has the purple rectangle. So that is where the mixture of Maddie and Kaylee's blood was found. And here is the document that shows you the number of contributors to that swab was 2. It was 88% considered to be Kaylee's and 12% Maddie's. There was no male DNA at all in that mixture of blood. It was just the two of them. Now, I think why some people are getting confused is because they tested for both autosomal DNA and then Y-assay testing. The Y-assay testing is done to detect if there is any male DNA present. And I know that there was some content creators that spotted that Y-assay and decided that that meant that there was an unknown male in that mixture on the back of the sheath. And that is absolutely false. Y-assay is done standard along with the autosomal to detect if there is male DNA. It does not mean there was male DNA. And if there had been male DNA along with Kaylee and Maddie's, it would have said 3 contributors instead of 2. So here's where it tells you more about that. So it says 1.4 indicates a mixture of DNA with a major profile which matches that obtained from the known reference sample of Kaylee Gonsalves. And then if you go to the next paragraph, it says Madison Mogan is a potential contributor to the minor component of this mixture. Okay, so it is Kaylee and Maddie's. And then if we go down further, because people keep talking about 1.2 and 1.3 and saying that inmate 163214 was excluded from that mixture. No, he wasn't. It was a mixture that was too low level to get results. So it says due to the low level results and limited data, no comparisons can be made. So he was not excluded from 1.2 and 1.3. Now you might say, right here, the document says that inmate 163214 was excluded from the DNA on the sheath, but that's not what it's saying. It's excluding him from 1.4, which is the two-person mixture of Maddie and Kaylee. So it's 88% Maddie's, or Kaylee's, 12% Maddie's. So of course, inmate 163214 is excluded from that because it's only Maddie and Kaylee's blood. It's their DNA. It's not anyone else's. But he was not excluded from 1.2 and 1.3. Okay, now just for reference, this was side A of the sheath. So that's the side that has the USMC snap or logo and then the snap on it. And 1.1 was where inmate 163214's DNA was found. It was single source and it was a large quantity. So do not let people tell you that it was a tiny speck. It was a large quantity. It was over 5 nanograms before it was diluted in the elution solution. And then 1.2 and 1.3 are also on this front side. And those are the ones that were low-level DNA that contained a mixture, and they could not determine any particular person because it was low-level DNA. So they could not rule out inmate 163214 as being a contributor to that. Now we talked about 1.4 and then 1.2, 1.3, and 1.1. So this is 1.5. And I'm bringing this up because another content creator tried to make it sound like this had been withheld from Ann Taylor.
that this had been suppressed and that this was hidden and buried in the reports. And no, it was not hidden and buried. It was turned over in discovery. 1.5 is the part of the sheath where the blade actually goes into. So they swabbed the inside. And that also could not exclude inmate 163214 because it was a low-level mixture. And here is where it talks about that. It says the partial DNA profile obtained from 1.5 indicates a mixture of DNA from 2 individuals. Due to the low-level results and limited data, no comparisons can be made.
So what we learned from all that is the only thing that inmate 163214 could be excluded from was 1.4, but not because it doesn't mean he didn't handle the sheath, but because that was a mixture of Kaylee and Maddie's DNA. And that was it. It was a 2-person mixture. So of course he was excluded. He could not be excluded from all the rest of the areas swabbed. And we know 1.1 was his DNA definitively. And he couldn't be excluded from 1.2, 1.3, or 1.5 because those were all partial profiles, low-level DNA. Now, I want to talk about the 2 unknown male DNA that everybody keeps leaning on as probable cause. And yes, Ann Taylor did her job, did a very good job. She has you thinking probable cause, 2 unknown male DNAs. The problem with that is it's not really probable cause when you look at it. And it would have been presented in court. They would have had the DNA experts talking about it. And of course, the jury would have then had to decide whether it was groundbreaking, earth-shattering, a bomb, a boom, whatever people try to claim about this stuff. But it was low-level samples with signs of degradation. And I'm talking about the spot on the handrail and the glove. And there's also issues about when the glove was found and everything too. So, but let's go with the handrail first. And that is item number 30. So we will look at what the reports say about that.
And so you can see what I'm talking about. Item number 30. Stain swab from bottom handrail, stair between floor 1 and floor 2. And you can see they did both the autosomal and the Y-assay again on 30, and it was positive for male DNA. And item 30 was a 3-person mixture. And it was 97% a major contributor and then 2% and 1% minor contributors. But it was a 3-person mixture of DNA. Now this is what it says about item 30. It indicates a mixture of DNA with a major profile, which was determined to be from an unknown male. And this was male B. So when you heard about male B, male C, male D, this was B. Assuming a 3-person mixture, 2 additional unknown individuals are potential contributors to the minor profile. Due to the low-level results and limited data, no conclusions can be made regarding the minor contributors. Then Ethan had been ruled out, and then it further went on in documentation to say that inmate 163214 was also ruled out. But that sample had degradation as well. It wasn't just low level, it had degradation. And that's usually an indicator something's been there a long time. And that's when you'd heard kind of the scuttlebutt that it was old. It was, they can tell whether it's fresh from a murder that just happened within the last 24 hours or blood that's been there for a while. And that had degradation. And it was also low level. Now, the other unknown male DNA was item 40, and that was the polar penguin glove. Now, just to show you when this glove was found, because that comes into play as to why it wasn't CODIS eligible, it was not found until November 24th, 2022, but here's where it was. It was laying in the parking lot approximately 25 feet from the front door. It was laying palm up and appeared to have been laying in that spot for a couple of days. It did not it did not have any snow on it, and it was frozen to the ground. Now, it had snowed on the 16th. So hard to say if there still would have been some frozen snow on there or not if it had been there clear from the murders on the 13th. But if you go back and look at body cam footage, this thing is sitting out in the parking lot 25 feet from the front door. It is not in any of that body cam footage from the day of the murders when everybody's out there. And if a glove had been out there lying in the driveway there, the parking lot, it would have been found. So clearly, this glove was not from the perpetrator. It was not from inmate 163214 or somebody else to cast reasonable doubt. It appeared later. So unless you think the murderer came back and dropped that glove off like a week later just to play games, which would seem highly unlikely, this glove is not relevant. But let's look at the DNA on it. And for reference, here are the item numbers for the glove. 40 was the glove itself, and then 40.1 was the swab of the stain on the palm under pointer finger. 40.2, stain on palm under pinky finger. 40.3, stain on ring finger, and 40.4 was the swabs inside of the glove. Okay, so the glove was pretty interesting. So it says the partial DNA profile obtained from item 40.1, which if we go back and look at 40.1, that was the palm under the pointer finger, and it was determined to be from an unknown male. This is unknown male D, and Ethan was not the source, and they later did exclude inmate 163214 from that part. But it was, even though it was just one profile, it was partial. And then they had a partial DNA profile obtained from 40.4, and that was the inside of the glove, and that was a mixture. And the major profile, they were able to exclude inmate 163214, but they could not exclude him from being a minor contributor. I'll show you that later. But that talks about 40.1 is a potential contributor to what was found on 40.4. And it says, due to insufficient quantity or degradation, only a partial DNA profile consisting of 2 alleles was obtained from 40.2. Due to low-level results, no conclusions can be made. And then the same thing with 40.3. It was degradation, insufficient quantity, only partial DNA, a single allele. So none of those were very good quality. Now, I want to point you to this very bottom paragraph. The major unknown male, male B, DNA profile obtained from item 30. So that was the blood spot on the banister. And the unknown male C, now we'll talk about unknown male C in a second here, DNA profile obtained from item 37.1, and the partial unknown male D DNA profile obtained from item 40.1 are not eligible for entry into the combined DNA index system. So that is CODIS. And then I'll show you where it does exclude inmate 163214 from the glove. Partial DNA profile previously obtained from item 40.1 was determined to be from an unknown male. Inmate 163214 is not the source of this DNA profile. The partial DNA profile previously obtained from item 40.4 indicates a mixture of DNA with a major profile. Assuming a 2-person mixture, inmate 163214 is not the source of the major DNA profile from this item. Due to the low-level results and limited data, no conclusions could be made regarding minor contributors. So he was never excluded as a minor contributor, but he was excluded as the major contributor.
Okay, so it's right in the report about the glove and the banister stain being excluded from CODIS. Now, CODIS has very strict guidelines. I have done a video in the past about CODIS guidelines. If you want, I can do another one again. But CODIS cannot take mixed samples. So they will not take a mix. Even if there is a majority, if there's still minor mixtures in there, they can't take it. CODIS cannot take something that's degraded. And there was degradation to both that blood spot on the banister and the glove. Partial profiles can sometimes be uploaded in CODIS, but it just depends on how many alleles they have, because they have to meet a certain threshold. And Also, location of where the item was. That glove was not considered to be from the putative perpetrator because it appeared days later in an area that had already been scoured. And like I say, you can go back and look at the body cam footage. You do not see that lying there in the parking area 25 feet from the door during the first couple days of the investigation. So it showed up afterwards. So it's clearly not related to the crime. And again, the blood on the banister was not eligible because it was degraded and it was low level. And it honestly sounds like, from the level of degradation, looking at the documents, that it was old. So neither of those were eligible. Now you might say, why couldn't they send them to Othram? Well, Othram is the resort for when something's not found in CODIS, but also IGG is not very conducive to mixtures. So they might have been able to send the glove. However, that one single male profile that was on part of the glove, because the other part had a mixture. But it wasn't ran through CODIS first because it wasn't eligible for CODIS. And so they're not going to send something that's not considered to be from the perpetrator to Othram. That would just be a waste of time and money. It's clearly not from the perpetrator. And as the blood on the banister being a mixture, being old, they're not going to send that either. But IgG is very hard to do with a mixture because you're trying to figure out family genealogy, and the process with an SMP profile is not conducive to mixtures. Now, let's talk about unknown male C. Okay, unknown male C is item number 37.1 and 37.2. And it was determined that those samples were from the same unknown male. So both of those swabs were from the same person. They ruled out Ethan Chapin, and then other unredacted people were not the source of the DNA profiles. So this DNA was not from any of the female victims, and it was not from Ethan. So these blood spots were not from any of the victims of 1122 King Road. Now, these spots also were not from 1122 King Road. These spots came from Jack Ducour's house, 1127 King Road, Apartment 1, his unit. 37.1 was a swab from the south entry hallway, and 37.2 was a swab from the west kitchen wall. And here in the ISP interview reports, you can see where when they looked in his apartment, they did find drops of blood in the entryway and the kitchen, and they did take those drops, samples of those drops. So what do we know from that? We know it wasn't Jack's blood. We know it wasn't any of the victims. So anybody they matched it against, it didn't match. So it was unknown male C, but it wasn't related to the murders. So only B and D were still technically unknown, but they were not eligible for CODIS, and they really were not anything huge for reasonable doubt, because DNA analysis, the analysts would have come into the courtroom and talked about how they were partial, they were low profile, they were degraded, they were mixtures, all the reasons why they were not considered to be from the putative perpetrator and not eligible for CODIS. So I hope this helps. I am not a DNA expert by any means. I'm just using my basic understanding of science, biology, chemistry, etc., understanding documents, court documents. I would say if you are not sure on any of this and want to learn further, because learning's always good, we all should be learning, ask an actual DNA analyst, a forensic analyst. And I'm not talking about a lab that's over on YouTube. I'm talking about an actual forensic analyst. And that brings up another good point. Brett Payne. Some people want to say he lied under oath. He didn't lie. He just didn't understand the process. When he said that if they had input another profile, it would have kicked the other one out, he wasn't understanding. Now, detectives, they don't deal with DNA, okay? The forensic teams are who collect the swabs and the samples, and then the labs, the actual analysts in the labs or who deal with the DNA and the CODIS guidelines. The frontline detectives, the police, they don't deal with any of that. So I give him grace on not understanding why they couldn't put those samples into CODIS, but Ann Taylor knew full well why they couldn't put them into CODIS. She was doing her job, which is to try to create reasonable doubt in the mind of the public. But in the end, unknown male B and D really were not a big boom. They weren't reasonable doubt. But let me know if there's something else you would like me to go over.